Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you with us for the Vertical Transformation of Leadership Culture webinar. Welcome to the webinar today. It'll be presented by Bill Passmore, Chuck Paulus, and John Mcguire of the Center for Creative Leadership. My name is Tracy Dobbins, and I will be your host for today. Before our presenters begin, we just want you to know that we love participation and invite you to use the chat tool provided on the right side of your screen. You can ask questions or interact with the presenters. Simply direct your chat to all participants. You can also correspond directly with me and our speakers by addressing your chat to host, presenter, and panelists. We will have a formal question and answer session that will be held at the end of the webinar today. Now, today's presenters, we have Bill Passmore, Chuck Paulus, and John Mcguire, who will be joining us. Now, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Bill.
Thanks, Tracy, and welcome, everyone. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. This is the first meeting of the Leadership Community of Practice of the STAR Lab Digital Organization Redesign Group that is sponsored by Spring Network, USC Marshall School of Business, and the Center for Creative Leadership, and funded in part by the Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources. So we're happy to have you here. There are a number of communities of practice that have been formed as a result of the first meeting of the companies that got together for the STAR Lab in August, and leadership was one of the topics that we decided we needed to address collectively, to hear a little bit more about it from people who are on the cutting edge of thinking about what's happening in leadership, and also to share with each other some of the things that we're learning about how to help leadership engage in digital transformation more effectively. So we have begun the work of the STAR Lab, which is to help us understand how we can accelerate and make more effective digital transformation in organizations. And we did a first session in August where we got our feet on the ground and covered a number of topics that were relevant to our organizations and thinking about what the challenges were. And we're now in the stage of trying to understand how to approach those challenges and to do some action research to try some things out that we hope will accelerate and make digital transformation more effective. So we're very fortunate today to have with us Chuck Paulus and John Mcguire, two of our senior research fellows at the Center for Creative Leadership, who've been working in the area of collaborative leadership, leadership culture, and vertical leadership for the past 15 years. I've done a tremendous amount of research and writing on that topic, and have been working with organizations to change their leadership cultures. So I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to get us started.
Thank you, Bill. Can everyone hear me? Could I just get a yes?
Yes.
Thank you, Bill. So welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. We only have a short amount of time today, so some of the stuff you'll hear will be kind of thrown into the middle for provocation, and we're happy to clarify. We've written a lot about the topic, but we wanted to give you something to chew on, so we're happy to do that. The proposed inquiry for this group from our point of view, and you could correct us, is what needs to change, if it does, about your leadership culture to successfully enact digital transformation? And then what is it going to take to change your leadership culture? And then finally, how capable do you personally feel to be able to change the leadership culture? So those are the questions in the middle, and we're going to introduce to you the topic of vertical development as a way to start answering those questions and a place to get a foothold. Now, before I jump in here, if you can just put in the chat box, which should be in your lower right-hand corner, you can all find your chat. And on a scale of 1 to 10, when I say vertical development, how familiar or even expert are you in the field of vertical development? It's been kind of in the air for actually for decades. Recently, getting more attention. It's some of it is derived from the work of Bob Keegan or Bill Torbert, and CCL has done some work. So just as I proceed, let me know if, especially if you're already an expert on this, I'd love to engage you at that level. So 10 if you're an expert, 0 or 1 if you have no idea about what this is. So let's talk about vertical development. And I'm going to sort of start pretty fundamentally, because this all does have a very fundamental basis in human psychology and sociology. And we can go pretty deep with it. And the notion is that the challenges we face, you face, digital transformation, all of us really, can be described simply by this term called VUCA. So I'm just going to use that as a shorthand for now. You've probably all seen it. It means that the challenges are, they're wicked challenges. They can't be solved with the wisdom of the past directly. So what does that mean? It means that human transformation is required, not just organizational transformation, not just leadership transformation, but at a very basic human level, we need to transform. And that means us individually and collectively. So let me just start with the depth of the question is what makes us human in the first place? If we're going to try to change culture, change people, we ought to know what being human is, or else, we can get lost and lose our values, and we don't want to do that. So starting at the basic human level is important. So again, I'll ask you to put this in the chat and just to think about it in the interest of time. What do you think makes us human? When you hear that question, have you thought about that? I'll be interested in your view because obviously there's no one right answer. You could put something in the chat if you're so moved to do before I do my reveal. Some people say art, some people say language, some people say, I heard E.O. Wilson say that what makes us human started around campfires a long time ago. But what do you think? Emotional intelligence, to learn and to adapt. Good. All these things. We think that one important answer is making meaning making. And all human meaning making is done in the face of some form of complexity, or else we just react. And so there's inherent meaning in things. If there's a fire that breaks out in your tent, then you don't need to construct too much meaning to get out. So there's basic facts, but then there's the way we construct meaning. And that's the important bit. The psychology of this, like I said, goes way back to Jean Piaget, Kohlberg, and more recently Bob Kegan and Bill Torbert. And the answer that they propose is that meaning making is what makes us human. And that if we study human beings, we can see that people develop in dramatic steps or stages, they're sometimes called. We don't necessarily like to call them stages because that sounds rigid, and it's not that rigid. But certainly children do. Children, they crawl, we walk, we run, and these are transformations. These aren't just simply learning a new skill. It involves all kinds of things in our bodies and minds. But adults do this too. So this was kind of a dramatic step that was proposed, that when we are 18 or 21 or whatever the age is, we're not done. And as adults, we could become increasingly more mature or grow up or develop bigger minds. This is all sort of metaphorical and rough language, and we just call it all vertical. And it means sort of up or grow up in simple terms. And our adult stage of development affects how we think and act at home and at work. And we call these action logics or leader logics, if you're more specific. And there's at least 7 of these in adulthood. And the catalyst is often being limited or getting stuck. And I like to say having fun because there's a huge element of curiosity and inventiveness and playfulness and art involved. So don't want to always frame it as, you're stuck. But that's what happens to a child crawling. They get stuck and they stand up. So let's unpack that. Let me just say that this vertical metaphor has a pair, and it's called horizontal development. So basically we're saying there's 2 kinds of leadership development. The horizontal piece is what we all do every day. It's adding knowledge and skills. We mostly get it from experts. It's about the content of what we think. And then there's vertical development, which is a little more difficult to get a hold of. It's more difficult to measure and assess for sure, but it's about growing abilities to think and act in more complex, systemic, and interdependent ways. You get this through life experience, and it's about how you think. It's about those action logics. These are metaphors, so please don't get too hung up on, vertical means higher, means better. Can you go back or forward? Both are necessary. And we base our work largely on the work of Bob Keegan and Bill Torbert. Torbert and Rook wrote a HBR article, 7 Transformations of Leadership. And actually, it's been one of their more popular articles of all time on the topic of leadership. So it really rings a bell for people. And I'm just going to show you the model. You know, often we're not so bold as to just jump right in and start labeling people. These are not labels for people. These are action logics. And there's 7 of them. And so I'm going to start at the bottom and go to the top. And what I invite you to do is to reflect on your own development. I'm going to ask you to do this now, and then I'm actually going to return to this in about 2 minutes. Reflect on your own development. And as I go from the bottom to the top, just think to yourself, how much of this action logic is involved? You know, when I was young, when I was maybe in college, first job, second job, where am I now? Where am I headed? Where do I want to be in my development? So the 7 stages that have been identified through research, there's the earliest, one of the earliest stages is opportunistic, a little bit narcissistic maybe, but except we don't call it that in children. You're just sort of naturally self-centered. And then the first big transformation there is diplomatic logic. You want to belong, you want to fit in, you want to be part of a group. You don't want everything for yourself anymore, you want it for the group. And then expertise is often what we really get involved in education and college. We really focus on that. Our whole action logic wraps around expertise. And then often achieving is a logic beyond expertise because it fuses many expertise domains. And then what begins to be somewhat more rare in our society and in our organizations for various reasons is redefining, transforming, and alchemical. And I'll just let you read those. Those are actually the qualities that a lot of our clients are looking for, frankly. So we'll spend some more time on those later, but I just wanted to introduce those to you. Let me give you a human example. Warren Buffett, whatever you think about him, he's been on a long journey, and what caught our attention is the giving pledge with Bill Gates and other billionaires to give away half of their fortunes, which seems to be in service of society. So we're starting to think, oh, this is transformative. This is a higher action logic. And one of our colleagues, Ed Kelly, did a dissertation on it, actually, and there's a lot of detail here, but you can see the 7 stages, the 7 steps as sort of mountain peaks. Again, the vertical metaphor gets a little annoying, you know, because it's probably not like climbing a series of mountains, but it might feel like that. So, you know, Warren Buffett was an opportunist in his early days. He ran away from home and he stole from Sears, okay? In college, he was awkward and took a Dale Carnegie course. As an expert, he was a logician and mathematician. As an achiever, you know, he really like broke the mold with the Buffett partnership. As an individualist, he had a period in his early 40s where he kind of went it on his own and invented, redefined, so that's actually the redefining stage with a different label on it, and strategists, building a wide range of business investments. And then finally, this alchemist stage marked by the death of his first wife, Susie, and the gradual unwinding of his fortune. Interesting, unwinding of the fortune. So that's a human example, and hope it makes it a little bit more tangible. And let me talk about what's underlying these stages, and probably the most important part. Whatever the stages are, there's drivers of vertical development. It happens, whatever the labels of the stages are, or how it works in your life, because your life is unique. But the drivers might be similar. And as I said before, often, not always, the transformational development, vertical development is driven by limitations in the current stage of meaning making. People get frustrated, stuck, experience limits of their current way of thinking. They care deeply about it. And there's support, curiosity, and desire that enables them to persist. So all of these are kind of a recipe for vertical development. And now I'm still talking about individuals, and John Mcguire is going to come on in a second and talk about cultures. We actually see a continuum from individual to team to organizational and cultural to societal, but we're starting here with vertical as an individual. And I'd like you to stop, reflect, write if you want, or just reflect in your mind. When did you first become an adult? Obviously, there's multiple answers to that question, and I've recently been sensitized to the fact that that's a very traumatic people for some of us, and so certainly if you don't want to go there, and even in your own mind right now, you know, pick another episode. But it's a very powerful period, and this is the kind of reflection we do actually when we're coaching people at greater depth. And so I just asked you about when did that happen? What period of your life was that? What was going on for you? What experiences were you having? What was it like to be you? And then what was the transformation from what to what? What did you, you know, what was it like to be sort of metaphorically crawling as an adult to getting up on your own 2 feet as an adult? What was that transformation? And as you're reflecting on that, writing a few notes, basically, you're not going to share these out. These are just for you. Here's some prompts. So I'm going to show you a few slides here, and if you want to just pick a word or two in the next couple slides that somehow capture something important in that period of transformation in your move to adulthood, just, you know, write it down or just make note of it, or, you know, let it broaden your memory a little bit about what was happening. And yeah, just reflect on what it was like. Here's another set of choices. And another set of choices. And this is actually part of a tool we use to talk about, to, you know, sort of get beneath the surface in the vertical development space and into the human space of development, because it could very easily become all too technical, all too dry, all too inhuman in some sense. So unless we bring, you know, play and love and dialogue and all these things into the conversation, you know, we're not really engaging. And that's actually where we take organizational culture to as well. So we'll talk more about that. I'm not even going to ask you. Oh, somebody asked me about the previous slide. Yes, I can do that. Not sure which previous slide you meant actually, but I'll just ripple through those a couple times. Yeah. So obviously, this is a pretty big space we're talking about. This is not, you know, feedback you're getting about how well you're listening, right? This is a different kind of a territory, this vertical stuff. And so I'm just going to repeat, you know, these are the drivers, and then I'm going to turn it over to John in just a second. But now turn the corner, think about these drivers as cultural, as collective, as collaborative. It's not just you as an individual getting stuck when you're a young adult. You know, whole cultures get stuck at various points in their progression. And the big idea here is that vertical development is both individual and cultural. We think even societal. These action logics are embedded in society, and that's where they live. And here's a definition of leadership culture. It's the part that grows vertically, and it answers these kinds of questions. You know, what does leadership even look like? Because from different stages of development, right, leadership looks differently. You identify who the good leaders are differently. What's it like to talk to each other? That's different in different action logics. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to having some chat with you in a bit, but here's John Mcguire.
Thank you, Chuck. Just in brief introduction, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So thank you, Chuck. Just in brief introduction, I've spent about the last 15 years studying leadership culture, but the previous 15 years I was in high tech in a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, which thrived and then failed, and I became just fascinated about what's going on in culture, what's going on in the collective of leadership that allows it to thrive as technology changes or enables it to die when technology changes. So what I want to talk to you about in the next 15 minutes or so is just a couple of really basic things. And the first one is, what is culture? And the next one is, how does culture change? If you really want to get serious about changing culture with changing technology, how does that work, actually? So what is culture? And we have this simple philosophy that says there is a hierarchy of culture, and each successive one is more capable of tolerating and dealing with more complexity, more ambiguity, more uncertainty, more VUCA. So to the question of what is culture, I'm going to posit something that may sound kind of silly, and I'm going to say that a group of chimpanzees seeking to eat is not so completely different than a multi-billion-dollar corporation trying to change into AI, and for the following simple reasons: that beliefs and tools and practices are at play and are the most fundamental things at play in both of those scenarios. So for a group of chimpanzees trying to eat, they have certain beliefs. They make meaning together, and they can create sticks, and they can and create tools in order to collect ants and eat. And in my lifetime, in these last decades, as I've seen technology change, we've gone from the challenges of value chains and manufacturing, across silos, to systems integration, to the big challenge of business process re-engineering, to what at one point, in terms of ERP systems, what was huge changes for many folks. I'm going to tell a story about an elevator company in a moment, in which when they first implemented their ERP system, they called it the disturbance, because it took them 2 quarters to actually get back to operation. So this advent of digital transformation is not new. It's the next step. It's the next big phase, and a quite daunting one in a whole series of such changes. And that if you want to get to outcomes such as alignment, you have to deal with those beliefs and practices and the tools that are required. And the reason is that beliefs drive behaviors. Whatever you believe to be true either is true or it's going to become true, because you're going to decide over and over again based on that belief and assumption, unless you take a deeper look at it and decide to change that driver. Next, Chuck, thank you. So if you look at the real evolution of organizations, certainly my father came back from a war with a life in the military, and for a long time there's been a strong belief in a hierarchy of leadership in a command and control, very tight environment that's concerned mostly with control. Big breakthroughs happened in the 60s and 70s in the high-tech world as companies began to adopt more hub and spoke. They started to distribute that decision-making power and authority into the local regions and areas, particularly as globalization started, in order for those decisions to be made more locally and more relevantly. Then, as we moved into this new century, we started to hear from clients kind of this requirement for more collaboration, more complexity, more overlapping, more things are really changing in significant ways. And if you look at this simple graphic, you can see how we've really progressed with an idea of leadership is this individual hero, where people are followers and you go get the goal, toward this 21st century view of, leadership is really in the collective of people, and it's about our common beliefs and practices that drive things. So to the question of how does leadership culture change, I'm going to I'm going to suggest 3 things happen and then demonstrate that a little bit further as we move forward. The first thing that happens is most of our assumptions and beliefs are unconscious. We make dozens to hundreds of decisions a day based on being unconsciously competent. We're pretty sure that we got to our high level of work in the world and our positions based on being good and being right, and that's all true. And the first step is to make those assumptions more obvious, more objective, to get them out of us and to share them kind of in the middle. The second big challenge in terms of how culture changes is to have the conversation about those insights and about those objective objects that we're able to come together and reveal between ourselves. I'm going to tell a story about a company that wanted to become the most competitive elevator and escalator company in the world, but discovered that their primary belief about competition was that competing internally was really a good thing. They had to shift that. The third thing that happens after you expose these assumptions, start to talk about them, is start to practice the actual changes in the work. So the key thing about how culture changes is you change those beliefs and practices, those beliefs and behaviors in the work itself as you change your systems and structures and processes together. Big problem with this, most businesses are so complex and so fast that it's really, really hard for people to slow down enough to be able to do this kind of work in order to power up. There's a big bias for this external focus and horizontal leadership, and it's tough to get to a more vertical view. Chuck, thanks. This is a bit of a review of what Chuck just told you about these logics, but I would say that we have been studying this. We're out front in research around this, and this shift from people in authority to collective activity is a big deal. It shouldn't surprise you that the majority of people of senior leaders test in this people in authority and dependent or conformer realm, and that there's a minority, less than 50%, in the independent and interdependent space. Chuck? Next. So Chuck walked you through the individual logics. Let's spend a little bit more time getting grounded in what these 3 types of leadership culture really are about, where the dependent conformer, where people are in authority, people are really concerned in this realm about control. It's the most important thing. First, it's about controlling things for the opportunist, then it's about controlling yourself, and then it's about controlling your expertise. I mean, let's face it, any sort of certification based job in the workplace is based on a certain level of expertise, and that's necessary, and it's really, really good. But it's also very much about control. And it's not until you move into the independent space that you begin to start to use technology as a resource for its own purpose. But your focus in an organization there is within your team or within your division or within your slice of the pie. And it's really not until you move into the collaborative, interdependent space that you start to be enterprise competent, or that you really start to care about being enterprise competent. And that's a big deal, because when the complexity of the challenge, such as digital transformation, requires that kind of more systemic, longer-term, deeper understanding of the way the entire enterprise interconnects, then you're not going to be able to be up to that challenge. Okay, Chuck, next. Thank you. We just wanted to say at this point, there's a lot of talk about culture, and there's a lot of work going on with culture. It really wasn't until, quite frankly, the 21st century that that practitioners thought that, or that organizations or that key leaders thought that culture was a lever that was feasible for change. And so we've focused on the most elemental part. We focused on leadership culture, which again is about beliefs and practices that drive the kind of outcome that you get, drive the kind of result, drive the kind of performance you get. So in some ways it's as simple as leadership culture is about, do you have the kind of capability that's required for the performance that you've set yourself up for in your strategy? Next, so a question for all of you, or a couple of questions for all of you. As you consider your digital transformation challenges and the consequent leadership challenges in this community of practice in Star Labs, consider that matching your leadership culture and capability with your organizational challenge is going to require two important things. First, it's going to require a common understanding of that level of culture across leadership. There's going to have to be some commonality, some common understanding, some shared way of getting that we are all on the same page and all at the same level of the challenge that we're facing. And the second is that in order to share this platform of leadership, then certain learning and development is going to have to happen in collaboration. So the question is, what is required of the culture, of the leadership culture, to meet tomorrow's challenge of transformation? Just want you to hold those questions, that question for yourself. I want to talk a little bit next about some of our research, tell you a story about a company that we spent 3 or 4 years with doing this kind of transformation. So we spent several years researching culture and change, and we got a lot of data, and we came up with 6 stages, and there's a lot of stuff in this slide, but we wanted you to focus just on one thing, because we found one factor that made all the difference in the world. All of those companies who were able to move forward in the transformation of their leadership culture based on their technical and technology challenges and other challenges, those who could make it were able to be involved in public learning, could actually have the conversation, could get to that trust of risk and vulnerability, take willingness to risk, to be able to get to multiple right answers, to get out of this sort of either-or stuckness and into multiple right answers, and then cobbling real solutions together, where the best ideas win rather than the biggest ego and the best argument wins, and where mistakes and failures are as valued as breakthrough. The flip side of this in terms of our research is that those who were not able to engage in public learning failed. They did not change. They couldn't get through. So it's as simple as, can you have the conversation? So back to those 3 simple stages of how does culture change. The second one is you've got to be able to talk about it, and you've got to be able to take the risks to do that. Do a quick time out here and tell you a story. We were working with a global elevator and escalator company. They were comfortable. They had big challenges. They had to move into a more eco-friendly elevator system. These were the 2 to 6 story type, and it was a huge technological change. And they were also doing their own levels of digital transformation, at least at the initialization phase, certainly in their processes and their supply chain management. Some of the functions were starting to play with it. What we were able to do with them was to spend time initially with their key executive team and to slow them down and to be able to have them release some of those assumptions that they had about the business. They decided that they wanted to be 1 or 2 in 5 different major industry leadership segments. Safety was one of them. They chose safety very specifically. They became #1 in the industry in safety within 2 years of this goal and this challenge. And one of the things that happened was there was a big argument going on at the table, and one of the regional managers said, you know, blankety blank, we'll never get better than 97.76%. I've been here for 25 years. We've never done better. We can't do any better. And he stopped himself and he said, that's it. We can't do better because we believe we can't do better. He caught himself in a live assumption. They began to have that conversation together. Another part of the story is when they discovered that I mentioned this before, they discovered that they wanted to beat the competition, but their greater belief in their bigger value was competing with each other. Once they started making those shifts, they were able to move into a very different environment. Chuck, just to give you very quickly a couple of pictures of that we have thought this through. We've been practicing in this arena for, as we said, 15 years, and we have some principles that we work from. A couple of them are that we have the senior leaders do the change work first. You can't have leaders developing leaders until those leaders themselves transform. And number two, that we're always developing towards a more collaborative capability. And then next, rather than the usual 7 change management phases, next, Chuck, we have a very different methodology in which we're really concentrating a kind of slowdown, particularly in the first phase, in which we're aligning strategy with culture. Let's get the basics right. If this transformation is going to be big and difficult, let's do this right. Let's get on the same page together, and let's get those senior leaders, sometimes as many as 40, even up to 100 in the transformation space together. Okay. Next, this is nothing but a picture, simple picture of a shift in the way that we're using graphics to show you that in this next, I'd like for you to take a couple of minutes. We have one of our tools here for you to play with. And what I'd like for you to do is think about the scope of the kinds of change challenges that you have in your organization. Are you thinking about a senior team? Are you thinking about a division? Are you thinking about the culture of an entire company? Sort of what's the scope? And on the right side of this graphic, you'll see where learning and feedback, which we think is really key in transforming leadership culture, that at this dependent level there, learning and feedback is really different than it is at the independent level, and where learning becomes a desire. It's part of how we do business at a more interdependent level. And on the left side, you'll see a series of indicators, half a dozen indicators that, for example, move from either or thinking to both and thinking. And I'd like for you to, as you think about the leadership culture that you you have a really significant change challenge for leadership and in the digital transformation challenges. Where would you draw a line and say, you know, this is complex, but our center of gravity is here? Where would you draw that line? I'm going to give you a minute or so just to read this and think about this. Where are we now? What's the truth about our leadership culture, and where do we function? Where are our beliefs and practices today? So if you've got a sense of that, then as we move forward, I'd also like you to draw in your mind a dotted line. What's the reality of your strategy? What's the direction of the business? What's your competitive challenge? Where do you need to be? What's required of your leadership culture in order to thrive into the future? And where would you draw that line? And as you do that, just think to yourself about, gee, what does that gap look like? And if we were to get serious about developing our leadership culture, what would that be about, and what sort of common understanding would that take in order for us to buy into some common development? I think next, Chuck, and let's skip this slide. So I think we want to spend our last 20 minutes together in some inquiry and to think about opening up some discussion here about what do we have in common, what's going on, and I think Bill, are you going to help us with at least kicking off that?
Sure.
That question for the invitation for inquiry? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, John and Jeff. This is really challenging and thoughtful, and I know in the STAR Lab itself, for those of you who were present, we were raising questions about where are we at as an organization? Are we aligned as leaders across our various business units and geographies in terms of digital transformation and what we think the strategy is and how we're going about it? And even more importantly, in some cases, do we think we have senior leaders at the level of understanding and alignment with what we're doing from a transformation perspective? Are they on board enough and understanding enough to be able to help lead us collectively towards the goal of transformation, whatever that might be? And I think for the most part, we concluded that we were kind of in a place where our leaders are supportive, but not necessarily strongly guiding or prioritizing our efforts, and therefore we see a lot of good work going on around the organization, but it's not necessarily strategic or connected in a way that's going to lead us to where we think we need to go. At least that was the tone within the meeting itself. So I would like to open it up at this point for you to comment on what you think some of the challenges are that you're facing in the digital transformation that your organization is going through, and does the level of vertical development of your leadership resonate with you in terms of something that needs to happen, that our leaders need to start to think more about the big picture and the interdependence of their actions and others' actions to make a shift really happen in our culture? And what would that take, in your view? Perhaps some of you are already working on that, changing your leadership culture, and if you are, we'd love to hear about some things that you've done. But mostly, we really value the opportunity to hear from each other just about what's going on in our organizations. That's what we found we enjoyed most about being together at our first meeting, was just hearing how's it going for you, what are your challenges, what are you trying to do with those challenges, and here we have a little bit of a new perspective on that. You know, maybe we need to think about our leadership culture. Maybe we're not as aligned and integrated as we need to be to bring together the transformational efforts that are happening in different parts of our organization. So if you have something to comment on about either where you think you are at the current time or some things that you might be doing to address those challenges, we'd love to have you share with each other some of what's happening. And Tracy, perhaps you could open the mic.
Yes, the mics are open now. Does anyone have a question?
This is Kathy Fire. I want to share a few things that are going on at BASF. And the challenge, I think, that we have when you ask that question, where is your leadership, when you have as large and complex as an organization as we have, I could say that we have pockets of leadership in every one of those stages. And I think our challenge is to get everyone moved to the highest level if possible. But we can only do that in stages. And since our meeting, there have been a number of things that have been going on in the organization, and these are only the ones that I'm aware of. In Germany, we launched our first, what was called a leadership camp, where we had a group of individuals who are in leadership roles come together and have a facilitated conversation about digitalization and the impact in their role as leaders and so forth. I'm anxious to connect with Martin, who's part of the team at the lab, to find out how that went. It happened, like, I believe, last week. And we have a member from North America who attended that so that we can determine whether or not that's something we want to bring. And I'm pretty sure it is, but how do we need to configure it so that it is successful in North America? The second thing is we are launching a series of webinars that are open to everyone across the globe around digitalization and the impact of digitalization among many topics. So for an entire week, there are going to be conversations and presentations, 2 of them each day, around the topic of digitalization, agility, application to innovation, and all of those kinds of things. So I think what is happening is a lot of things that have been going on behind the scenes are now coming out and being implemented in a very public way. And Andrew, Andy, who's part of our team too in the lab, he and I are going to go back and have conversations with each one of the leaders who you interviewed, Bill, and continue the conversation and share the summary of the feedback and talk about what they can do and what we can do to assist them. And we're in the process of forming a sort of like a steering committee advisory group around digitalization. So these are some of the things that we are doing, and you know, are we going to get a copy of these slides? Because this would be a good way for us also to make sure that we are covering all the bases in terms of helping move leaders. And I look at this as a multi-pronged series of continuous actions, activities, conversation situations that all of a sudden, hopefully in 3 years, 5 years, I mean, each year we can look back and say, hey, we've moved the needle a little bit further.
Yes, we're happy to share the slides, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. So that's what's going on, and I don't know if Andy or Martin are on the call or if anything to add, but I think it's an exciting time, and I'm very encouraged to see the number of folks who are involved in working on this across the organization.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Catherine.
Being able to capture the common themes of that conversation could be very useful across boundaries. See what's in common.
Catherine, question for you. Do you, as an organization, talk about the culture as something that you're evolving or changing specifically?
Yes. I believe that is definitely a thread. In fact, we have an approach that we have been utilizing with any kind of major transformation within our businesses, either across all of manufacturing or within one of the businesses, that utilizes a lot of those steps, starting with the leadership team, having them define the vision for the future around the culture. Where are we today? Where do we need to be in terms of specific behaviors, actions, et cetera? How big is the gap? What do we need to do? And then focusing on what we call mindsets and behaviors, and equipping leaders and the employees as we cascade this in the organization with tools to help them identify what is their mental paradigm and what is getting in the way of their ability to embrace the change, and what do they personally need to do differently. How do they need to show up individually, starting at the leadership level as a leader and collectively as the leadership team. And, you know, it's a whole comprehensive program, and it is now become pretty ingrained in a majority of the organization, and this is just in North America. That as leaders move into different roles within different sites or in different businesses, they take the knowledge of that methodology and continue to apply it, or have us partner with them to help them apply it as they make changes in the culture. So they focus not only on the what of any kind of transformation or change, but they what do we need to do in terms of the how we do things, our behaviors, our mindsets, our culture, and so forth. So it's not holistic in terms of the entire organization looking at it, but it's more in terms of, for our area of responsibility, for our business, for our function, when there is a change, we definitely focus on it from a cultural perspective.
Beautiful. I love all that and would love to explore it more with you further. We have a few more minutes left, so I'd like to see if anyone else out there would like to share their insights on what they're doing around culture.
I don't know quite how to articulate my thoughts on this, but my company is a little different. I'm at Magellan Healthcare, and our company is probably around 10,000 or so, and I'm relatively new to the company, just been there about 7 months. But so my observation, being new to healthcare and new to Magellan, is that being in healthcare is highly regulated, so it tends to produce a lot of people who are very risk averse. And so particularly individuals who have been in healthcare their entire careers, which is most people, I've observed, they tend to be very reluctant to take risk, particularly as it regards to change and digitalization. But what we're seeing at Magellan is a lot of new people coming into the organization who are trying to modernize, and that includes digital transformation. But particularly the old guard are very reluctant to take on those changes. And so the senior leadership is very interested in modernizing and putting forth these digital transformation efforts. But particularly the middle and lower ranks are bringing up all of these complexities that make that difficult, that are legitimate concerns. So senior leadership is trying to address those one by one, and it becomes this kind of perpetual game of whack-a-mole where we try to address one problem, which brings up another and another and another. And what ends up happening is the culture of this risk aversion, where they're saying, but what about this? What about this? What about this? Ends up kind of stalling these modernization efforts through legitimate concerns, even though the leadership is highly supportive of modernizing and bringing forth all of this new technology. This culture of trying to make sure everything is accounted for ends up kind of slowing us down. So we're getting in our own way because we don't want to forget about anything, and it's slowed down my own team as well, because we're trying to do the same thing at my team level. And every time we try to move away from, sending things out via paper, for example, we get told, like, well, we don't have email addresses for all of our customers, so we shouldn't do that. We should send it out via paper. That's a silly problem to have, frankly, when we can't even think beyond the idea of maybe making phone calls and doing an outbound campaign to ask for email addresses, for example. So it starts getting to the point where we're so narrowly focused on the way that things have been done that because that feels safer, it gets to the point where we can't even see that there are other ways beyond problems. And leadership is trying to address that in I think a limited way, by trying to keep, frankly, people calm and make sure that they understand that they're being heard, by trying to address their concerns. It's causing, I think, problems because they're just putting out small fires here and there rather than addressing them in a strategic way. And I'm at a middle manager level in the organization that I don't have regular access to a lot of the executive team to say, hey, there's probably a better way to do this. And I have had difficulty saying, well, is there a strategic way where we could say, here's the path forward, and we can have it both ways, where we can address the risk and move us forward collectively.
Sounds like a great challenge that you have, Jennifer, and I think it's probably shared by many of our participants on this call. And the value of this community of practice around leadership is that we can continue to talk to each other about how we address these things, and try some things out, discover what works and what doesn't, do our action research and our learning in public, and see if we can't help to get our leaders on board. Because the sense is, thanks to John and Chuck, we understand that if they're not at that higher level of understanding and vertical development that it's hard to address the challenges that you just described. It, you know, it becomes an either or. Either we can do email or we can do mail, or, you know, either we can take a risk or we can't take a risk.
I do think there's a certain brilliance, Jennifer, in your suggestion that, you know, if you could get people into the next step of what you're already doing, of both and, into a sort of what if. What if we accept the resistance and do this experiment at the same time? It's you know, there's really no risk in the experiment, and what happens in what your instinct is about, what your belief is about that, what happens is you start to build, do that 2 times, 3 times, you start to build an experience in which people haven't necessarily changed their stage of culture or logic, but their state, the state that you've got them in, we call it headroom, you're building headroom. You're starting to build the experience of doing both and thinking and both and action. Yeah, we can acknowledge the risk and take the action at the same time. And our key question is, well, what if we just did this? So I want to encourage, we want to encourage you to do that and keep going with that. That's really the right pathway.
Oh, yeah. The more I can kind of get the word out there would be I think will help. It's just I've worked in heavily regulated environments before, but there's just the aversion to change is very new to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, quick observation coming from this vertical idea. So there's 2 ways to focus what you're talking about. One is, what should the organization do? What are the organizational dynamics? You know, all the whack-a-mole, those are systemic issues and cultural problems, and those are wicked problems. And so we're talking about how to engage those. That's one focus. The other focus that vertical provides is that it underlines self-development, personal development, individual development. So one of the things we can talk about further, if we convene, you know, in some sort of inquiry, is when you're faced with all that, what are your particular options? You know, where are your action logics? You know, what's going on in your life? What are you learning? How are you growing? So we still keep that individual developmental focus. And you know what? Sometimes that's where you work is, you know, what you can sort of touch and see and feel yourself when other doors are closed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're near the end of our time, and I just wanted to thank John and Chuck for presenting today, and say that we'll be following up with you to see if there's an interest in going deeper into this topic of how you do vertical development and how you change leadership cultures. For some of you, not all of you, will want to pursue that in more depth, but for those who do, we want to create an opportunity to continue that dialogue and perhaps try out some things in organizations that could work. And our leadership of community practice, leadership of community, will continue to explore other topics and ideas in the realm of leadership with presentations from other organizations and your own thoughts about where we need to go going forward. So we'd ask you to continue to think about what this community would like to do and how we can help to move things along together, since it is our community. But we want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, and we'll look forward to continuing the interaction as we go forward.